The trouble started, as most trouble did in Elias Vance's life, with a dress that wasn't his and a plan that wasn't his either. Just for one evening, his sister Cordelia had begged, wringing a handkerchief between her fingers until it looked ready to tear. "Lord Bramwell will be at the masquerade tonight, and if father sees me refuse to dance with him one more time, he'll have me married off by autumn. You're the only one who can slip past the guards without being noticed." Which was how Elias found himself in the receiving hall of Draymore Castle, wearing his sister's spare silver mask, breathing through the tight lace of a borrowed coat, trying very hard to look like a demure young Omega and not like a 24-year-old man who had climbed over a garden wall to get there. It was going reasonably well. He had successfully avoided Lord Bramwell for almost 40 minutes, ducking behind a pillar, then a fountain, then a rather startled harpist. He had just congratulated himself on his stealth when a hand caught his elbow and spun him neatly into a dance he had not agreed to. "You've been avoiding me all night," said a voice like warm stone, rough at the edges and startlingly close. Elias looked up and up into the face of the king, not Lord Bramwell, the king. King William of Draymore, the White Wolf, the man whose wolf form was said to be the color of first snow, whose profile was stamped on every coin in the realm, currently holding Elias's waist with one hand as if he had every right to. "Your Majesty," Elias said, in a voice several octaves higher than his own, "I believe you have mistaken me for someone else. Have I?" William's eyes, gray, unfairly attentive, of the coat that did not sit right on Elias's shoulders. "You move like a soldier, not a debutante, and no Omega I know smells like ink and burnt candle wax instead of rosewater." Oh no, Elias's mind, usually his most reliable asset, went entirely blank. "I enjoy reading. By candlelight. It's a hobby." "Is it?" William said, sounding entirely unconvinced and worse, entirely delighted. He did not let go of Elias's waist. The music swelled, and against every instinct screaming at him to flee, Elias found his feet falling into step, because refusing a direct dance with the king in front of the entire court would draw exactly the kind of attention he had spent all evening avoiding. It was going almost tolerably, until Lord Bramwell appeared at the edge of the dance floor, caught sight of Elias' mask, Cordelia's mask, the one Bramwell had been chasing all night, and lit up like a man who had found his missing shoe. "There you are," Bramwell called, cutting straight through the dancing couples with the grace of a man who had never once considered that other people existed. "I saved you the last dance, my sweet." Elias felt the king's hand tighten fractionally at his waist. "My sweet," Bramwell continued, oblivious, reaching for Elias's hand, "you cannot keep running from me all evening." "I believe," William said, in a voice that had dropped several degrees, "that this dance is taken." Bramwell blinked at the king as though noticing him for the first time, went the color of curdled milk, bowed so quickly, he nearly toppled a candelabra, and fled. Elias watched him go with something between relief and hysteria bubbling in his chest. When he looked back, William was watching him with an expression Elias could not read at all. Not quite jealousy, not quite amusement, something unfamiliar and warm that made the back of Elias's neck prickle. "He seemed very devoted," William said mildly. "Should I be concerned?" "Extremely not," Elias said, with more feeling than was probably wise for a supposed stranger to display about another man's suitor. "Good," William said, and did not explain why it was good, and Elias did not ask, because explaining anything right now seemed like the fastest way to end up beheaded, banished, or, worse, recognized. He made his excuse 3 songs later, mumbling something about fresh air, and half ran, half stumbled out through the terrace doors, his heart going like a rabbit's. He did not look back to see the king's gaze following the silver mask all the way out into the dark. He did not know, either, that the White Wolf King had already asked his steward, quietly, the very next morning, to find out which family owned a silver mask with a chip in the left eye-hole, and a mysterious guest who smelled of ink and burnt candles. 3 weeks later, Elias was cataloging herbs in the East Wing Infirmary, his actual job, the one his family didn't mention at parties. Keeper of the castle's medicinal stores and occasional stitcher of careless nights. When the door opened and the entire room seemed to lose several degrees of air. "You," said King William, filling the doorway in a way that seemed almost unfair for one person to manage, "smell exactly like ink and burnt candles." Elias dropped a jar of dried yarrow. "Your Majesty," he said, scrambling both for the jar and for dignity, achieving neither. "I don't know what you, silver mask, chip in the left eye. danced like he'd rather be anywhere else in the castle except in my arms, and then vanished like the terrace had swallowed him whole. William stepped inside, and the door shut behind him with a soft, deliberate click that Elias felt in his sternum. It took my steward 3 weeks to work out that the Vance family keeper of herbs disappears from the infirmary at exactly the hours his sister claims to have a headache. That's a very specific piece of detective work for a king to undertake over one dance, Elias said, aiming for dry and landing somewhere closer to squeaking. I'm a very specific sort of king. William came closer, and up close his eyes were not simply gray but gray shot through with pale gold, like frost-catching morning light. His wolf, Elias realized with a lurch, was right there under his skin, curious and unhurried. Why did you run? Because I wasn't meant to be there at all. Because I was covering for my sister. Because, Elias exhaled, because dancing with the King of Draymore was not on my list of things to survive that evening, and yet, somehow I did, and then I panicked. Something in William's face eased, softened at the edges. You could have simply told me that. I could have. I was also fairly certain, Your Majesty, I'm not actually a debutante, I'm the herb keeper in a stolen dress, was not going to end with me keeping my head. William laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, warm and rough and entirely too charming for Elias's peace of mind. I've beheaded exactly no one for wearing the wrong dress to a party, Master Vance. I'm told it's bad for morale. Comforting, Elias said, and found, despite himself, that he was smiling. William picked up the fallen jar of yarrow, turned it over in his large hands, and set it back on the shelf with more care than a king should reasonably have for dried herbs. I'd like to see you again. Not at a masquerade, not in a stolen dress, simply you, if you'd allow it. Elias's pulse did something complicated. Kings don't usually ask permission. This one does, William said. When it matters. Elias did not have a witty answer for that. He said yes instead, and spent the rest of the afternoon absolutely unable to remember which jar contained yarrow, and which contained valerian, which resulted in a minor infirmary incident involving a very sleepy stable boy that he never fully explained to anyone. Captain Gideon Ashford, broad-shouldered, perpetually amused, and the only man in Draymore permitted to call the king an idiot to his face, and live to repeat the insult, found William in the training yard the following morning, methodically destroying a wooden practice dummy with far more enthusiasm than the exercise required. You've killed that poor thing 3 times already, Gideon observed, leaning against the fence post with the easy insolence of a man who had known his king since they were both gangly boys learning to hold a sword properly. Should I ask who you're actually imagining, or would you rather keep pretending it's swordsmanship practice? I have no idea what you mean, William said, and split the dummy clean in half. Right. Of course not. Gideon watched the wooden torso topple into the dirt with theatrical solemnity. Tell me, does this mystery person have a name, or do I simply keep referring to him as the reason the king has personally rearmed half the training yard in a single week? William set down the practice sword, breathing hard, and, to Gideon's very great and immediate delight, turned faintly, unmistakably pink at the ears. Oh, Gideon said, grinning outright now, it's that kind of trouble. His name is Elias Vance, the infirmary keeper? Gideon's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. The one who stitched my arm after the border skirmish and lectured me the entire time about drinking willow bark tea instead of whiskey for the pain? That's him. He told me, and I quote, that I had the pain tolerance of a particularly dramatic goose. Gideon looked, if anything, more delighted by this revelation than by anything else Williams had said. I like him already. Does he know you're the king? Or is this one of those situations where you've been sneaking around the castle like a love-struck stable boy, hoping he won't notice the crown? He knows precisely who I am, William said with as much dignity as a man could manage, while still holding half a broken practice sword. And I am courting him properly, or attempting to. He is somewhat resistant to romantic gestures on the grounds that he finds them, and I quote, excessive for a Tuesday. A man who won't simply swoon because you're the king. Gideon clapped a hand to his chest as though wounded. William, I believe you may have finally met someone worth the trouble you're about to cause yourself. What trouble? The trouble, Gideon said, pushing off the fence and clapping his king soundly on the shoulder, of an entire court that will spend the next several months trying to talk you out of loving someone who didn't arrive with the correct bloodline attached. I'd start preparing counter-arguments now if I were you. Alaric alone will have opinions enough for the whole nobility. William's jaw set, the easy humor draining briefly from his face. Let him have opinions. They will not matter. No, Gideon agreed, quieter now, some of the teasing falling away. I don't imagine they will. Not to a man who just destroyed 3 practice dummies over one dance. He picked up William's discarded sword, testing its weight thoughtfully. For what it's worth, I've watched you sit through 100 arranged introductions, with the enthusiasm of a man attending his own funeral. Whatever this is, it's the first time in years I've seen you actually smile about it beforehand, instead of only enduring it after. That's worth defending, crown or no crown. It was, William reflected later, the closest thing to blessing he was likely to get from the one friend whose opinion he actually valued, and it would matter more than either of them knew, in the difficult months still ahead. It happened on a hunting trip gone wrong, 6 weeks into whatever it was they were now, not courting, not courting, an unnamed and increasingly obvious thing that had the whole castle placing quiet bets. The stuff came in fast off the eastern ridge, and what should have been an afternoon ride turned into chaos. Horses spooking, the hunting party scattering for cover, and Elias, who had insisted on coming along to tend to any injuries, thrown from his mare when lightning split a tree not 20 feet away. He remembered the fall more than the landing, the world tipping, the crack of a branch, the white flash of pain in his shoulder. And then William was there, human no longer, a wolf of impossible white fur standing over him with his hackles raised against the dark, growling at the storm itself as if it were an enemy that could be frightened off. William, Elias gasped, and the wolf's head swung toward him, and something in those gray-gold eyes recognized his name even in that shape, because the growling stopped, and the great white body curled protectively around him instead, blocking wind and rain both, warm as a hearth despite the storm hammering down. Elias didn't remember deciding to bury his face in that fur. He only remembered the steady thrum of the wolf's heartbeat under his cheek, too fast, frightened in a way the growling hadn't let on, and the low whine that vibrated through William's chest every time Elias's own breath hitched with pain. By the time the rest of the hunting party found them, the storm had eased, and William had shifted back, bare-chested, his coat wrapped tight around Elias's shoulders, and he had not once stopped touching him, one hand fisted in the fabric like he was afraid the wind might still take Elias if he let go. "You could have been killed," William said, voice raw. Once the physician had confirmed it was only a wrenched shoulder and not broken bone. "You could have simply let your wolf handle a bit of rain," Elias said, though his own voice shook more than he'd like. "My wolf," William said, quiet and fierce, "does not leave what's his out in a storm." The word has landed somewhere under Elias's ribs and stayed there, glowing, for days. That night, unable to sleep for the ache in his shoulder and the louder ache of something entirely unrelated to bone, Elias found William waiting outside the infirmary, arms crossed, looking like he hadn't slept either. "I frightened myself today," William admitted low. "I have faced armies without half the fear I felt watching that tree come down near you. I'm all right," Elias said softly. "Truly, I know." William reached out, brushed a damp curl from Elias's temple with a gentleness that did not match the size of his hands at all. "I would still like to keep you somewhere the storms can't reach, if you'd let me." Elias, who had spent his whole life being the sensible one, the one who kept lists and catalogued herbs and refused to be swept into anything, found himself leaning into that palm without a single sensible thought in his head. "I think," he whispered, "I'd like that very much." The kiss that followed was slow, careful, William's hand cradling his jaw as though Elias were something rare enough to break. And when they broke apart, foreheads still touching, William was smiling in a way Elias had never seen on the coin-stamped, portrait-painted, legend-shaped face of the king. It was, Elias thought dizzily, a considerably better ending to an evening than being beheaded for a stolen dress. Word of the king's courtship spread through Draymore Castle, faster than any royal decree ever had, and with it came all the usual noise. Congratulations from the guards who'd taken bets, disapproving mutters from the older nobility, and one Duke Alaric Crestwell, who did not bother disguising his displeasure at all. "An infirmary keeper," Alaric said one evening at supper, not quite under his breath, "when there are omegas of proper bloodlines who'd—" "Careful, Alaric," William said pleasantly, not looking up from his plate, "or I'll have you assigned to the infirmary yourself. I hear Master Vance is very fond of leeches. Elias, seated at William's left, a placement that had scandalized precisely everyone except William, nearly choked on his wine, trying not to laugh. Later, walking the gardens, Elias brought it up. "You didn't have to defend me. I'm quite capable of ignoring a duke. I know you are." William's hand found his, unhurried, thumb tracing slow circles over Elias's knuckles. "I simply enjoy doing it. Watching his face when I do it, enjoy it, perhaps, even more. You're terrible. I'm the king. I'm allowed to be terrible to dukes who insult the man I intend to marry." Elias's steps faltered. "You? What?" William, infuriatingly, only smiled and kept walking, forcing Elias to hurry to catch up, spluttering. "I said no such formal thing yet. I only said intend. There's a difference, Elias. One requires a ring and considerably more groveling on my part, which I am prepared to do in time. You are the single most." Elias grabbed his sleeve, half laughing, half exasperated, entirely too fond. "You cannot simply announce marriage in the middle of a garden path like you're commenting on the weather." "Then marry me somewhere more romantic," William said, turning to face him fully, eyes bright with mischief and something steadier underneath it. "And I'll ask properly." Elias, who had 100 clever retorts ready at any given moment, found he had none at all. He settled instead for kissing the smugness clean off William's face, which seemed to satisfy them both equally well. Cordelia arrived at the castle 3 days later, ostensibly to deliver a basket of preserves from their mother, actually to interrogate her brother with the single-minded thoroughness of a younger sibling who had heard every version of the rumor except the true one. "You danced with the king?" she hissed, the moment they were alone in the infirmary storeroom, "wearing my mask, pretending to be me, and somehow this resulted in you nearly marrying him, and you didn't think to mention any of this in your letters home?" "I mentioned the masquerade. You said, and I quote, 'The masquerade was eventful.'" "Eventful, Elias. I have had considerably more eventful experiences buying fish at market." "To be fair," Elias said, fighting a smile, "I wasn't entirely certain any of it was real until quite recently myself." Cordelia studied him for a long moment, and whatever she saw in his face, something helpless and fond and entirely undone, made her expression soften from outrage into something gentler. "You actually love him. I actually do, which is deeply inconvenient, since I had a perfectly organized life before he decided to notice me." "For what it's worth," Cordelia said, squeezing his hand, "Lord Bramwell has since become entirely devoted to a viscountess from the eastern provinces who apparently does not mind being chased through gardens, and father has stopped threatening me with autumn weddings altogether, on the grounds that having a son courted by the king rather changes a family standing." Her grin turned wicked. "So really, brother, you've solved 2 problems at once. You're welcome. I did that entirely by accident." "The best solutions usually are," Cordelia said, and hugged him properly before she left, already composing in her head the version of the story she intended to tell their mother, one considerably more dignified than the truth, and considerably less entertaining. Elias's own accomplice in castle mischief was a lanky young stable hand named Thomas, who had been sworn to secrecy about the masquerade dress since the very first night, and had kept that secret with the smug superiority of a boy who knew something the rest of the castle didn't. "You do realize," Thomas said one afternoon, mucking out a stall with considerably less enthusiasm than he brought to gossip, "that half the kitchen staff have a wager running on when the king will actually propose. I have 4 silver pieces on midsummer. You shouldn't be betting on my life, Thomas." "I absolutely should, because I am winning." Thomas leaned on his pitchfork, delighted. "Griselda in the kitchens thinks it'll be sooner. She says His Majesty has been requesting extra honey cakes sent to the infirmary for weeks now, and a man doesn't send honey cakes unless he's already decided." "Those honey cakes," Elias said, with as much dignity as he could summon, "are simply a kind gesture. Master Vance." Thomas fixed him with the patient, unimpressed look of a 17-year-old who had seen quite enough of the world to know better. "The King of Draymore does not personally instruct the kitchens on anything, ever, according to every servant who has worked here longer than a fortnight. He has done so 4 times this month. For you." Elias had no answer for that, which Thomas took correctly as a personal victory, and spent the rest of the afternoon whistling in a manner Elias found deeply insufferable. Duke Alaric Crestwell. Watching from a shadowed colonnade the night, William had all but announced his intentions in the garden, felt none of the castle's easy delight. His face did not settle so easily into fondness or amusement. It settled instead into the particular, careful stillness of a man recalculating every plan he had ever made for his own family's advancement. He had spent 11 years positioning his niece, Lady Seraphine, as the obvious match for a king who had shown no interest in marrying anyone at all. Patient years, expensive years, years of quiet alliances built specifically for this outcome, and watched them collapse in the space of one masquerade and one storm. That same night, in the privacy of his own study, Alaric drew out paper he had been saving for exactly this kind of contingency, and began composing a letter to a contact in Ferrowick, a minor clerk in that kingdom's treasury office, easily bribed, who had once, years ago, processed a resettlement to Vance and Ferrowick estates over a disputed parcel of borderland. It was nothing at all, that old settlement. A dry, dull transaction any land office in the realm might have handled identically. But dry and dull could be dressed in different clothes, if a man was patient and careful and entirely without scruple about what he cost other people in the process. And Alaric intended to be all three. A pension, he murmured to himself, testing the shape of the lie on his tongue before he ever committed it to ink, structured precisely to align with certain dates, timed rather too conveniently, wouldn't you agree, to be entirely coincidental. He signed the letter, sealed it, and told himself, as men like Alaric always managed to tell themselves, that he was doing this for the kingdom, for its stability, for a crown that could not afford an heir whose legitimacy might one day be questioned by a rival house. He did not tell himself that he was doing it, because he could not bear watching an infirmary keeper sit where his niece had been promised to sit for over a decade. That truth he kept folded away somewhere, even he preferred not to look, alongside every other convenient omission a desperate man collects on the way to doing something unforgivable. The morning Elias discovered he was carrying, he cried for almost an hour, not from fear, though there was some of that, but from something far larger and warmer that he didn't have a name for, sitting in his chest like sunlight through glass. Omega men carried rarely, and only when the bond ran deep enough, the physician told him gently, a mark of a true match, not simply a passing courtship. Elias pressed both hands over his still flat stomach and thought, absurdly, of a white wolf curling around him in a storm, growling at the sky itself to keep him safe. William's reaction, when Elias finally found the courage to tell him, was somehow both instant and slow motion, his face going through shock, disbelief, and then an unguarded joy so total that he actually staggered, catching himself on the doorframe, before crossing the room in 3 strides and lifting Elias clean off his feet. A child, William breathed, forehead pressed to Elias's, voice cracking with something Elias had never heard from him before. Our child. For 9 days it was the happiest Elias had ever been. On the 10th day, Duke Alaric requested a private audience with the king, and everything changed. Elias never learned exactly what was said in that room, only that William emerged from it pale and silent, and did not seek Elias out that evening, or the next. On the 3rd day, when Elias finally cornered him in the map room, William's face had gone to stone. Ferrowick, William said without preamble, has been in contact with your family for 2 years. Financial contact. Considerable sums. Elias went cold. What are you saying? Alaric has proof. Letters. William would not meet his eyes. Structured precisely to align with the timing of your arrival at that masquerade. A child born from an Omega with Ferrowick backing would have a claim contested for a generation. It would tear Draymore apart from the inside. You think I planned this? Elias's voice came out smaller than he wanted, disbelief cracking through every word. You think I orchestrated a masquerade encounter, a storm, a pregnancy? William, look at me, look at me. William did look at him, and for one terrible suspended moment, Elias thought he saw the answer in his eyes before William even spoke it. I don't know what to think anymore, William said, low and wrecked. I want to believe you. I want that more than I have ever wanted anything. But I am a king before I am a man who loves you, and if there is even a chance that this child was conceived as a weapon against my crown. Then, say it, Elias said, tears he refused to let fall burning behind his eyes. Say what you actually mean. William's jaw worked. When he spoke, the words came out like something torn rather than said. I mean that I cannot trust a pregnancy that arrived so conveniently timed to serve my enemies. I mean that you, might be a trap I walked into with my eyes open. The room went utterly silent. Elias felt something inside him, the sunlit, glowing thing from 9 days ago, Go dark and small and very, very quiet. I see, he said, and his voice did not shake at all, which surprised him more than anything else that terrible morning. Thank you for making that so clear, Your Majesty. He left the map room with his spine perfectly straight, and did not let himself break until he was 3 corridors away, alone, one hand pressed hard against his stomach, as if he could shield the small life there from words that had already been said and could not be unsaid. Elias did not confront William again. There seemed no point in arguing with a man who had already decided, in the space of one conversation with a duke who despised him, that love and treason could wear the same face. He went, instead, to the one person in the castle who had never once doubted him. Nell, the king's own wet nurse from decades past, now retired to a quiet cottage near the eastern gate, who had held Elias's hand through the whole terrified, wondrous process of carrying a child no one had told him how to carry. "He's beautiful," Nell whispered, 7 months later, looking down at the small, sleeping bundle in Elias's arms. Dark-haired like Elias, but with his father's storm-gray eyes already unmistakable, even half-lidded in sleep. "What will you name him?" "Alaric didn't win," Elias said quietly, which wasn't an answer to the question, but was the only thing he could think to say as he traced one finger down his son's impossibly small cheek. "Whatever else happens, he didn't win. This child is not a weapon. He's just ours." He named him Rowan, after no one in particular, simply because it was a strong tree that bent in storms and did not break. The letter Elias left was short. He had rewritten it 11 times and still could not make it say everything. So in the end, he let it say only what mattered. "He is yours as much as mine. I will not raise our son believing his father thinks him a weapon, but I will not take him from you either, because whatever you believe of me, I know what you are capable of feeling for him. Love him without the doubt you gave me. That is all I ask. E." He left Rowan in Nell's arms at the castle gate before dawn, kissed his son's forehead until Nell gently reminded him the sky was lightening, and walked away from Draymore with nothing but a healer's satchel and a grief so large it had no edges. William found the letter 3 hours later, and the child an hour after that, and it took every guard in the castle to keep him from riding out into open country with no plan and no direction, roaring Elias's name into a dawn that gave no answer back. It was Duke Alaric, cornered at last by the king's steward, who had quietly kept investigating even after the audience that shattered everything, who broke first under questioning, confessing that the letters from Ferrowick had been forged on his own order. The pension to Elias's father, nothing more than a routine land dispute settlement, twisted into something sinister by careful omission. There had never been a plot. There had only ever been a duke who could not stomach an infirmary keeper wearing the king's ring, and a king who had let old fears about crowns and traps speak louder than a year of knowing exactly who Elias was. William held his newborn son in the map room where he'd broken everything, and wept in a way the castle had never once seen its king weep, and swore, to Rowan, to the empty room, to no one who could yet forgive him, that he would find Elias if it took the rest of his life. It took 4 months. William searched with a single-mindedness that alarmed his council and delighted absolutely no one, riding out personally to every healer's guild, every quiet village infirmary, every place a man who catalogued herbs for a living might disappear to. He brought Rowan with him more often than his advisers thought wise, on the grounds, stated once, and never again, because his tone left no room for argument, that his son would not grow up not knowing his father's face. Whatever else remained broken. Captain Gideon rode with him, more out of loyalty than duty, having appointed himself unofficial minder of both the king's temper and the infant's alarming capacity to produce noise at 3 in the morning. "You are aware," Gideon said, somewhere around the 2nd week, jostling a shrieking Rowan against his shoulder, with the weary competence of a man who had done this rather more than any bachelor captain should reasonably need to, "that you are the king of Draymore, and there exist wet nurses and attendants for exactly this purpose. He settles better for me. He is currently screaming into my ear at a volume that could summon the dead, Your Majesty, so I would very gently suggest that theory requires revision." It was, in fact, Gideon who devised the trick that finally worked, humming, off-key and entirely without shame, the same 3 notes of an old marching song, until Rowan's shrieking dissolved into hiccuping, suspicious silence, and then, eventually, sleep. William watched this with the particular helpless gratitude of an exhausted father, and filed away, privately, that his captain of the guard would be entirely unbearable about this later. "Don't," William said. "Don't what? Whatever insufferable thing you're about to say." "I would never," Gideon said, in the tone of a man already composing the story he intended to tell the entire barracks the moment they returned home. The search was not without its indignities. In one border village, William, travel-worn, unshaven, dressed deliberately in plain clothes to avoid drawing attention, was mistaken by an enthusiastic innkeeper's daughter for a disreputable traveling minstrel, on the grounds that no respectable man traveled with an infant and no luggage besides a satchel of nappies and a sword he clearly didn't know how to properly conceal. "You've a fine singing voice, I'd wager," she told him, refilling his cup without being asked, "for a man running from something. Debt, is it, or a woman?" "Neither," William said, with as much patience as 4 months of grief could summon. "A man, then," she said, delighted with her own deduction, and would not be dissuaded no matter how firmly William insisted otherwise, so that by the time they left the village the following morning, 3 separate patrons had asked William to perform a song, and Gideon had laughed so hard over supper that he'd had to leave the table entirely. "I am never recovering from this," Gideon informed him, wiping his eyes. "The White Wolf King of Draymore, mistaken for a heartbroken traveling bard. I shall be telling this story at your funeral. You will not be telling this story at all. I absolutely will be telling this story at every opportunity for the remainder of both our natural lives," Gideon said, entirely unrepentant, and proceeded to do precisely that at the next 3 inns they stopped at, each retelling somehow more elaborate than the last, until by the 4th telling William had apparently also composed several ballads and once serenaded a milkmaid, neither of which had happened, and both of which Gideon insisted improved the story considerably. Despite the teasing, perhaps, in some quiet way, because of it, those weeks on the road were the only thing that kept William from unraveling entirely. Grief left too much room to think, and thinking in those months meant replaying the map room over and over, hearing his own voice say the words that had cost him everything. Gideon's relentless, undignified humor was its own kind of mercy, however William groused about it in the moment. He found the trail first in a border town 3 days south, where an apothecary recalled a quiet, sharp-eyed young man who'd worked 3 weeks mixing tinctures before moving on, refusing payment beyond bread and a bed. Then a monastery infirmary, where the monks remembered him fondly and reported apologetically that he'd left just 2 days before William arrived, headed toward the coast. By the time William reached the fishing village of Hallowmere, salt-worn and sleepless, carrying an infant who had become disturbingly used to the rhythm of horseback travel, he was down to his last thread of hope and an entire kingdom's worth of stubbornness. He found Elias behind the village's tiny infirmary, hanging herbs to dry in the afternoon sun, 3 months thinner and infinitely more guarded than the man who'd once laughed at a stolen dance. Elias saw him first, saw the horse, the guard at a respectful distance, the small bundle strapped carefully against William's chest, and every herb in his hands fell to the ground at once. "William." His voice cracked over the name. "I was wrong." Before any explanation could soften the blow of what he'd done, "I was wrong, and I was cruel, and I let a man who hated you plant doubt in me faster than a year of loving you could root it out. There was no plot. There never was. Alaric confessed it 4 months ago, and I have spent every day since trying to find you to say so." Elias's eyes went to the baby, and something in his face cracked open entirely. "Rowan, he has your nose," William said, unsteady, closing the distance between them with careful, unhurried steps, as though Elias were a wild thing that might still bolt. "And my eyes, apparently, which Nell tells me constantly, usually while comparing him unfavorably to me at that age. He sleeps terribly. He is, by every account, the most stubborn infant in the kingdom's history, which I am told he inherited from precisely one of his 2 fathers, and I will let you guess which." A wet, disbelieving laugh escaped Elias despite himself. "I don't expect forgiveness," William continued, quieter now, close enough that Elias could see the exhaustion carved into his face, 4 months of searching written plainly there. "I only came to bring your son to you, if you'll have him. And to tell you the truth I should have said before I ever let doubt speak instead of me. You were never a trap, Elias. You were the only true thing that ever happened to me, and I very nearly threw it away because I was more afraid of losing my crown than I was of losing you. and I have never in my life regretted anything so completely." Elias reached out with trembling hands, not for William, but for the small sleeping weight against his chest, and William unstrapped the carrier with careful, practiced hands and placed their son into his arms without hesitation, watching Elias's whole body curve protectively around the child in a motion that mirrored almost exactly a white wolf curling around him in a storm 4 months and a lifetime ago. "He's gotten so big," Elias whispered, tears finally falling freely as tiny fingers curled around his own. "William, he's gotten so." "I know," William said, voice breaking entirely now. "I'm sorry you missed it. I'm sorry for all of it. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have reason to doubt where you stand with me again, if you'll allow me the chance." Elias looked up at him, this king who had crossed a kingdom on nothing but stubbornness and love, who stood before him now with no crown in sight, only a man terrified of having lost everything that mattered, and felt the last of his carefully built walls give way entirely. "You're an idiot," Elias said, laughing and crying in equal ungainly measure. "A royal, thoroughly idiotic, entirely forgiven idiot." William made a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and gathered them both, Elias and Rowan together, into an embrace so careful and so fierce that the village fisherfolk passing by gave the strange trio a wide, curious berth, none of them realizing they had just watched their kingdom's missing king finally come home. They were married in spring, in the gardens where William had first announced his intentions like a man discussing the weather, a fact Elias brought up in his vows purely to watch William's ears go red in front of the entire assembled court. "I believe," Elias said, standing before the priest with Rowan gurgling happily in Nell's arms nearby, "that I was promised a proper proposal, somewhere more romantic than a garden path, and instead I received an ambush disguised as a marriage announcement. I am marrying you regardless, because apparently that is simply what one does with impossible, stubborn kings. But I want the record to show that I was owed a better proposal." "Noted," William said, straight-faced, "and entirely too late to correct now. So I suppose you'll simply have to marry me out of spite. I fully intend to." The court, uncertain whether laughter was appropriate at a royal wedding, dissolved into it anyway when the priest, thoroughly unbothered, having married this particular kingdom's nobility for 30 years, simply sighed and said, "Shall I continue, or would you two like to keep bickering through your own vows?" Duke Alaric was not present. He had been stripped of his title the previous winter and exiled to a distant holding, where, several guests noted with considerable satisfaction, Fairwick's ambassador had since sent him a strongly worded letter objecting to being blamed for a plot that had never existed in the first place, on the grounds that if they had wanted to plant a scandal in Draymore, they would have done a far more competent job of it. Elias, informed of this letter by a gleeful steward, laughed so hard he nearly dropped his own wedding bouquet. When the vows were finally spoken, properly this time, with rings and witnesses, and one small, delighted shriek from Rowan at exactly the moment the priest declared them wed, as if the baby had been waiting for his cue, William kissed his new husband slowly, thoroughly, and entirely without regard for the court's collective composure. "Better proposal owed," Elias murmured against his mouth, "still pending, your majesty." "I'll spend the next 50 years making it up to you," William murmured back. "Starting tonight." "Good," Elias said. "I intend to hold you to every single one of those years." At the feast that followed, Captain Gideon rose with a goblet of wine, and the particular gleam in his eye that every soldier in the room had come to recognize as a warning. "For those who don't know me," he began, "I am Captain Gideon Ashford, and I have had the extraordinary misfortune of knowing our king since he was 11 years old, and fell off his very first warhorse directly into a mud puddle in front of the entire training yard." "Gideon," William said, warningly. "I have also," Gideon continued, entirely undeterred, "spent 4 months on the road with him earlier this year, during which time he was mistaken for a traveling minstrel, serenaded absolutely no one despite what certain rumors suggest, and sang his own son to sleep so badly that I eventually had to intervene for the sake of everyone's ears within a mile radius." He raised his goblet higher, grin softening into something more genuine. "But I have also watched that same man cross a kingdom on nothing but stubbornness, refuse to give up when every sensible adviser told him the trail had gone cold, and come home not with an army or a treaty, but with the 2 people who actually make him worth following into battle in the first place." To Elias, who is patient enough to marry an idiot, and to William, who finally had the sense to go and get him back. The hall erupted into laughter and applause in equal measure, and Cordelia, seated near the front, thoroughly delighted by the entire spectacle, leaned over to Elias with tears of laughter in her eyes. "I like him," she said, nodding at Gideon. "I like him considerably more than Lord Bramwell, and I never even danced with him." "Don't," Elias said, laughing despite himself. "One royal wedding per family is quite enough excitement for a decade, Cordelia. I'm simply making an observation. Make it further away from me." Nell, holding a delighted, overtired Rowan against her shoulder, caught Elias's eye across the hall and smiled. The same steady, unshakable smile she'd worn through every terrifying, wondrous moment of the past year, and Elias felt, for the first time since a folded letter and a dark castle gate, that the ache which had lived in his chest for so long had finally, quietly, healed over. 3 years later, the storm season came to Draymore as it always did. Sudden, loud, rattling the castle shutters with the same fury it always had, and Elias woke to find the bed beside him already empty. He found them in the nursery, unsurprised. William, human still but sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, 3-year-old Rowan tucked against his chest, both of them watching the window with matching storm-gray eyes as lightning split the sky. He wanted to see it, William said, not looking away from the window, and then decided halfway through that he was in fact terrified of it but too proud to say so directly. "I am not scared," Rowan announced, from the safety of being wrapped in both his father's arms and half his father's shirt. "I am simply supervising the storm." "Of course you are," Elias said gravely, settling onto the floor beside them, because there was no possible universe in which he was going back to bed while his family sat on a nursery floor watching a thunderstorm like it owed them an explanation. "Papa says," Rowan continued, with the confident authority of a toddler repeating something he'd overheard, "that you once got caught in a storm just like this one, and he turned into a big white wolf to protect you, and that's how you fell in love. That is..." "Roughly accurate," Elias said, glancing sideways at William, who had the grace to look only slightly sheepish. "Though I believe the falling in love happened somewhat before the storm. The storm mostly confirmed it." "Can I see the wolf?" Rowan demanded, wriggling around to look up at his father with an expression that suggested this request was not in fact optional. William glanced at Elias, silently asking permission to make the nursery considerably more crowded, and Elias, laughing, simply gestured at the room. "Go on then. Supervise the storm properly." The trouble with being married to a man who noticed everything, Elias had long since decided, was that it made keeping a secret from him feel roughly as difficult as hiding a bonfire under a tablecloth. He had been planning for 3 weeks, 3 careful, quietly triumphant weeks, during which he had smuggled dried lavender and rosewood shavings up from the lower town market, borrowed a very specific carving tool from the castle woodworker under the transparent excuse of infirmary shelving, and enlisted Nell as an alibi no fewer than 6 separate times. Their 3rd wedding anniversary was a fortnight away, and for once in his life, Elias intended to be the one who arrived with a surprise instead of the one perpetually caught off guard by his husband's absurd, extravagant gestures. It was going, by any reasonable measure, extremely well, which was precisely why it alarmed him so thoroughly to discover, on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon, that William was also sneaking. He caught it first in small things, the way William had taken to disappearing after supper, with vague, unconvincing excuses about correspondence that required no correspondence at all, given that Elias had personally seen the steward deliver the day's letters already answered. Then in the way Captain Gideon kept catching Elias's eye across the great hall with an expression of barely restrained hilarity, the particular look of a man who knew something delicious and had been sworn, under considerable duress, not to share it. "You're hiding something?" Elias announced, cornering his husband in the map room 3 days later with all the confidence of a man who had spent years learning to read every twitch of William's face. "I have no idea what you mean," William said, in the exact tone of a man who absolutely did know what Elias meant, and was rather enjoying not saying so. "You've been disappearing after supper for a week. You smell like sawdust and beeswax, which is a combination I only ever associate with either the woodworker's shop or someone about to confess to a crime." And Gideon looked at me this morning like I was a particularly amusing tragedy he was watching unfold in real time. Gideon looks at everyone that way. It's simply his face. William, Elias. William stepped closer, entirely too pleased with himself, and pressed a kiss to his husband's temple that did absolutely nothing to distract from the question and everything to make Elias momentarily forget what the question had even been. I could ask you the very same thing, you know. You've been smuggling lavender up from the lower town for weeks and paying the woodworker in honey cakes that Griselda swears you never once requested from the kitchens on your own behalf. Elias went very still. That's an entirely different matter, is it? Yes, because I am planning something thoughtful and you are clearly planning something excessive, and I refuse to have my anniversary gift overshadowed by whatever elaborate nonsense you've concocted this time. William laughed, the full, warm, unguarded laugh that still, after 3 years, did something helpless to the inside of Elias's chest every single time he heard it. You wound me. I'll have you know my plan is entirely restrained. You once had the entire East Tower repainted because I mentioned in passing that I preferred a different shade of blue. That was a reasonable response to a stated preference. It was excessive, William. It was thorough, William corrected, entirely unrepentant, and refused to elaborate further, no matter how thoroughly Elias interrogated him over the following days, which only made Elias more determined to finish his own project first, purely as a matter of principle. The trouble was that principle, it turned out, was a poor substitute for actual planning, and Elias's carefully constructed timeline collapsed spectacularly 4 days before the anniversary itself, when Rowan, now 6 years old, endlessly curious, and constitutionally incapable of minding his own business, discovered the carved wooden box hidden at the back of the infirmary storeroom and brought it directly to his father with the solemn pride of a boy, certain he had found something important. Papa, look what I found. Elias, elbow-deep in cataloging that week's herb shipment, turned around just in time to watch his entire 3 weeks of careful secrecy walk into the room in the small, delighted hands of his own son. Rowan, sweetheart, where did you find that? Behind the yarrow jars? Is it a present? Can I open it? No, Rowan, please don't. It was, of course, too late. The latch, which Elias had specifically and deliberately left unfastened in case the wood needed airing, gave way beneath one enthusiastic 6-year-old thumb, and the box fell open to reveal its contents scattered across the storeroom floor. A small carved wolf, painted white, curled protectively around a smaller carved figure. 3 pressed lavender sprigs, one from each anniversary, and a letter, sealed, addressed in Elias's careful hand to William. Rowan stared down at the wreckage of his discovery with the dawning, horrified realization of a child who has just understood, several seconds too late, that he has ruined something. Is this Papa's present? He asked, very small. Yes, Elias said, kneeling to gather the scattered pieces with hands that were, admittedly, shaking slightly with the particular grief of a carefully guarded secret meeting its untimely end. I'm sorry, Rowan said, and to his credit, the apology was entirely genuine, his small face crumpling with the specific misery of a child who adored both his fathers equally and had just accidentally wounded one on the other's behalf. I didn't know. I'll help you fix it. I promise I won't tell Papa, William. I promise. Oh, come here, Elias said, laughing despite himself, despite the disappointment, gathering his son into a hug that smelled faintly of dried herbs and castle dust. It's all right. It's truly all right. Some secrets simply aren't meant to survive the week, it seems. He said this with considerably more grace than he felt, and spent the walk back to his own chambers composing, with mounting dread, several different ways to explain to William that his carefully planned surprise had been unceremoniously discovered by their own son 4 days early. He needn't have worried, as it turned out, because William met him at the chamber door with an expression of such profound, barely contained guilt that Elias knew immediately something had gone equally, catastrophically wrong on his husband's end of things. I have to tell you something, William said, and I would ask that you not be too disappointed, given the circumstances. William, what? Gideon, William said, with the particular flatness of a man delivering news he had, already privately, made his peace with, was meant to be delivering a very carefully worded letter to the castle musicians, requesting a specific piece for the anniversary feast. He instead, through some combination of poor timing and worse luck, handed the letter to the wrong servant, who delivered it directly to the kitchens, who understood it as an entirely different request altogether, and the long and short of it, Elias, is that half the castle now knows I have spent 3 weeks secretly commissioning a song, because the musicians came to thank me for the commission, in front of an audience of no fewer than 11 kitchen staff this very morning. There was a very long pause. You commissioned a song, Elias repeated. It seemed romantic at the time. William, I found out about your surprise because Gideon cannot deliver a letter to save his own life, and you found out I know about it because our 6-year-old accidentally destroyed my present to you not 4 hours ago. William blinked. He did what? It's a long story involving yarrow jars and a latch I foolishly left unfastened, Elias said, and then, entirely without meaning to, began to laugh. The helpless, undignified sort of laughter that arrives after weeks of careful secrecy collapse in the space of a single afternoon, laughter that had nowhere else to go except straight out of his chest. William stared at him for exactly 3 seconds before he, too, began to laugh, both of them leaning against the chamber door frame, thoroughly undone, an anniversary's worth of careful planning in ruins around them, and neither one able to summon a single ounce of genuine regret about it. We are, William said, wiping his eyes, without question, the 2 worst-kept secrets in the entire kingdom. Speak for yourself. I very nearly made it 4 full days. You were sabotaged by our own child. And you were sabotaged by Captain Gideon, who I remind you is a grown man entrusted with the safety of an entire castle and cannot successfully deliver 1 letter to the correct recipient. In his defense, William said, still grinning, he did eventually deliver several other letters correctly that same day, which I understand is being considered a personal triumph in the barracks. They spent the remaining 4 days simply not pretending anymore, which turned out, unexpectedly, to be its own particular kind of gift. Elias sat with William in the evenings, while the carved wolf was carefully repaired by the very woodworker who had made it, the small chip in its ear, courtesy of one enthusiastic 6-year-old, sanded smooth and repainted until it looked, if anything, even finer than before. William, in turn, stopped pretending he wasn't nervous about the song, humming fragments of the melody under his breath at odd hours until Elias had half of it memorized before the musicians ever performed it properly. You know, Elias said, the night before the anniversary itself, both of them tangled together in the enormous bed William had once commissioned specifically so they would never again have cause to sleep apart. I had rather hoped to surprise you. You did surprise me. I had no idea you'd commissioned a carving. I only knew about the letter, and even that I only found out because it went catastrophically wrong. It's not much of a surprise if you already know the shape of it. Elias. William turned onto his side, propping his head on one hand, studying his husband's face with the same unhurried attention he had given him that very first night in the infirmary, 3 years and 1 entire lifetime ago. I have known the shape of loving you for 3 years now, and it still manages to surprise me nearly every single day. I don't think that's the sort of thing that requires secrecy to work properly. I think it simply requires you. Elias, who had spent a great deal of his life being the sensible, unromantic one, found, as he so often did in moments like this, that he had absolutely no defense prepared against a sentence like that. That, he said finally, is deeply unfair of you to say the night before I'm meant to give a proper speech at our anniversary feast. I'll allow you to steal it for your speech, if it helps. Absolutely not. I refuse to quote you at your own anniversary. The court would never let either of us hear the end of it. They already never let us hear the end of anything, William pointed out, entirely reasonably. Gideon is still telling the minstrel story 2 years later. He will still be telling it at our funerals. Undoubtedly, William agreed, and pulled Elias in closer, tucking him beneath his chin, the way he had every night for 3 years, the shape of it as familiar now as breathing. I find, on the whole, that I don't mind being teased for loving you badly disguised and rather too obviously. It seems a small price for getting to keep you. You didn't love me badly disguised. You loved me catastrophically disguised. The entire kitchen staff knew about the song before I did, a minor miscalculation, a catastrophic one. Regardless, William said, pressing a slow kiss to his temple, unbothered, entirely content, I intend to go on making them. Miscalculations, secrets, catastrophically obvious gestures, all of it, for as long as you'll have me making a fool of myself over you. That, Elias murmured, already half asleep against him, sounds like considerably more than 50 years of trouble. I did promise you 50 years. I never said they'd be quiet ones. The anniversary feast itself was predictably an unmitigated disaster of sentiment. The song, performed with far more enthusiasm than the musicians' 3 weeks of secret rehearsal quite warranted, turned out to be a genuinely lovely piece about storms and white wolves, and a herb keeper who had once run from a dance floor, and it left half the assembled court, Cordelia included, openly weeping into their wine by the second verse. Cordelia, seated near the front, with a goblet she had long since stopped pretending not to refill, leaned toward Nell partway through the second verse, and whispered, entirely too loudly for the intimacy of the moment, "I have never in my life seen a grown man cry this consistently at his own family's misfortune of feelings. He wept at the naming ceremony. He is weeping now. I begin to suspect it is simply a permanent condition. It is a permanent condition," Nell confirmed, dabbing her own eyes with far less shame than the observation warranted. "I nursed him as an infant, and I can promise you," he cried, just as easily then. "Some things a person simply doesn't outgrow, whatever crown they're given to wear over it." "Well," Cordelia said, raising her own goblet toward the high table with fond, wine-warmed affection, "I suppose it's rather better than the alternative. My brother spent 24 years being entirely too sensible for his own good. It does my heart considerable satisfaction to watch someone finally undo him properly, and so publicly." Rowan, seated between his fathers and entirely too invested in his own small role in the evening's proceedings, tugged insistently at Elias's sleeve the moment the musicians finished. "Papa, is the present fixed? Is it all right now?" "It's perfect," Elias assured him, and meant it. The small chip in the wolf's ear had been sanded away so thoroughly that no trace of the accident remained, and if anything, the creature looked warmer for having survived it, its white paint gleaming softly in the candlelight of the great hall. "You didn't ruin anything, sweetheart. You simply gave us a very good story to tell at the next anniversary, and the one after that most likely, knowing your Uncle Gideon's memory for embarrassing details." "I'm going to tell it properly," Rowan announced, with the grave importance of a boy who had recently discovered that stories, once told well enough, could outlive the events themselves. "I'm going to tell everyone I saved Papa's present by finding the mistake early, so there was time to fix it." "That is," William said, biting back a laugh, "a remarkably generous version of events, and I fully support you telling it exactly that way for the rest of your life." Elias's own gift, presented afterward with the particular solemnity of a man determined not to be outdone by a commissioned ballad, was simpler. The repaired carved wolf, curled around its small companion figure, alongside the 3 pressed lavender sprigs and the letter Rowan had so nearly destroyed. A letter that, once William finally read it in the quiet of their own chambers that night, made him go very still and very quiet in a way that had nothing at all to do with disappointment. "You once told me your wolf does not leave what's his out in a storm," the letter read in Elias's careful hand. "I have thought of that more than you know in every year since. Not because I ever doubted it again, you made certain of that 100 times over. In 100 small ways I have never once taken for granted. But because I think, now that I understand it properly for the first time, love isn't only the storm, William. It's the very ordinary, unremarkable mornings after it, the ones where nothing dramatic happens at all, where you simply wake beside me and I wake beside you, and neither of us has to search a kingdom to find the other, because we are already exactly where we're meant to be. Thank you for every ordinary morning. I intend to spend the rest of them exactly like this, beside you, and thoroughly, ridiculously happy about it." William did not manage a witty reply to that. He simply held Elias for a long, quiet moment, forehead pressed to his temple, and said nothing at all, because for once in 3 years of teasing and grand gestures and catastrophically obvious secrets, nothing needed saying. Downstairs, in the great hall, Gideon was already 3 cups of wine deep into retelling the minstrel story to a table of visibly delighted new recruits, embellishing it, as always, well past the point of recognizable truth. And upstairs, wrapped together in the quiet dark of their own chambers, the King of Draymore and his husband had long since stopped needing anyone else's version of the story at all. They had, after everything, the storm, the doubt, the letter left beside a sleeping infant, the kingdom crossed on nothing but stubbornness, simply this, an ordinary anniversary, badly kept secrets, a 6-year-old's earnest apology, and each other. It was, they had both quietly come to agree, exactly enough. The shift was, as it always was, a ripple, a breath, and then the great white wolf sat where a king had been a moment before, tail thumping once against the floorboards in unmistakable amusement. Rowan shrieked with delight and launched himself directly into the wolf's fur with absolutely no regard for royal dignity whatsoever, which the wolf accepted with the placid tolerance of a creature who had clearly done this before. "You are entirely too indulgent with him," Elias said, though he was already settling against the wolf's other side, tucked beneath one enormous white foreleg as easily as he had that very first storm. The wolf huffed, a sound suspiciously like a laugh, and curled more fully around both of them, warm and solid against the noise outside, exactly as he had 4 years and one whole lifetime ago. Elias closed his eyes, listened to the storm rage uselessly against the shutters, and thought that whatever tricks fate had played on them, masquerades and misunderstandings, dukes and doubts, a letter written 11 times and a search that spanned a kingdom, they had landed, against every reasonable expectation, exactly here, warm, together, thoroughly, ridiculously happy. "Papa's fur is very soft," Rowan informed his other father solemnly, muffled against white fur. "I know," Elias said, smiling into the dark. "I've been telling him that for years." The wolf huffed again, tail thumping twice this time, and outside the storm went on raging at a family who had long since stopped being afraid of it. Downstairs, entirely unaware that the king had once again abandoned his own bed for a nursery floor, Captain Gideon was losing a card game to Cordelia Vance, with considerably worse grace than any decorated soldier should reasonably display. "You're cheating," Gideon said for the 3rd time that evening. "I am simply better than you," Cordelia said, sweeping her winnings toward herself with the serene confidence of a woman who visited the castle often enough now to have learned every one of the captain's tells. Perhaps the great Captain Ashford should stop wagering against a woman who grew up gambling against a brother who catalogues herbs for a living and has entirely too much patience for detail. "I am reconsidering my opinion of your family." "Too late," Cordelia said sweetly. "You already gave a very moving speech at my brother's wedding about how wonderful we all are. I have witnesses." Gideon groaned and dealt another hand, and somewhere above them, muffled through castle stone, came the distant, delighted shriek of a 3-year-old prince informing his fathers, with great authority, that the storm was now fully under control, which was, all things considered, exactly the kind of ordinary, ridiculous happiness that a folded letter, a search across a kingdom, and one very stubborn king had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, managed to build.